Hi everyone, this is Nicholas Rivera, your professor for English 1001. So I thought it'd be a neat video to accompany the text in action to explain the angle of vision as it is in the Allen and Bacon guide. For those of you who don't have the Allen and Bacon guide, I made this video just so that everybody has the same information and we're on the same page. So the angle of vision is basically a system to analyze what it is that persuades an audience. And we look at this through three angles: the ethos, pathos, and logos. But specifically, we look at ethos, pathos, and logos, how it affects audience and the purpose of it and the genre of it. So for a very important thing to cover, first of all, is rhetoric. And according to your Allen and Bacon guide, it is the study of how human beings use language and other symbols to influence the attitudes, beliefs, and actions of others. So these three images I have here, they represent rhetoric in some shape or fashion. The bewilderment, puzzlement, you have a mishmash of genre in the middle photo, and then you have the audience on the bottom left corner. So the way we use rhetoric, the way we use it in English class is rhetoric is what defines how we write and how we as an audience read. So when an author is writing something, the rhetoric they're using is tools, styles, methods to persuade an audience member to believe something. So that is what rhetoric is. And when we talk about rhetorical effect, we mainly talk about great orators who have such power in the voice. So Martin Luther King speeches, John F. Kennedy speeches, speeches by Obama, they employ tools of rhetoric to sweep us along with their ideas, to make us uncomfortable about issues of race and justice in the United States. So authors and speech makers, they use rhetoric to influence people. So for audience, when you as a student are writing papers for any class, for any major, the University of Cincinnati, we really encourage that you, when you're writing something, that you write for an audience of your peers. So you're never writing specifically for the teacher, because that's just a bad form, in that if you're writing for the teacher, oftentimes what I've done in the past is that I will write with the assumption that my professor knows exactly what I'm talking about, because they're the teacher. They should know everything I know about my subject. Making that assumption will generally leave a lot of gaps in your essay, because you're not going to be explicitly stating all the moves you're making. So when you're trying to explain an idea, you say, here's the idea, and then there's going to be some skips because you're just going to say, well, here's the end. And then you're going to leave it up to your professor, who you can rightly assume knows your subject, to fill in the gaps. But when you write for an audience of peers, so people who have the same knowledge as you, you're going to take care to explain the steps you're talking about so that everybody understands, everybody's on the same page. So one important thing I always want to stress is that the audience is not static, meaning they just don't read, watch, and walk away. The audience, they want to be moved by the piece. The audience, they want to understand the message. So it's important to note that we do something to the audience on purpose as writers. Now, when we think about purpose, again, as a writer, when you're writing, there's always a purpose behind your writing. You want to answer a question. Maybe you're puzzled about why it is that everybody's making such a big hoopla over the Confederate flag in South Carolina, and that there's two lines drawn. You know, it's an important part of cultural history, but it's also a symbol of racism in the United States. So maybe a question for a paper would be, why is it that people are so divided on this issue? And that's your purpose for your essay, so you'd be writing trying to answer that purpose. Another way to think about purpose is, for the audience, what do you want your audience to do with your paper? After they've read it, after they've watched your video, what do you want them to take away from it? So anytime you're writing something, you're recording something, it's important to consider the purpose. What do you want the audience to do? What do you want to do to the audience? And to go along with that, how a genre is developed, if you're going to be doing comedy or satire, farce, romance, drama, genre is also dependent on purpose, because if you're going to be selecting a comedy genre, then you chose that on purpose, and you know that people are going to be taking away from your ideas based on this comedic influence you have. So a good example of that is Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, who uses comedy to deliver the news. So there's a purpose for that. the genre of comedy is used to deliver very important grave news in a satirical way so that we can laugh about it, think about it, and then realize that there's something wrong with it. Now, genre, this is the form and structure in which you write. Try not to think about terms of genre as, in the previous example I said comedy, romance, drama. A way to think about genre in terms of academic writing is that if you are an art designer or you're an architect major, there's a certain genre of how you write papers. If you're a history major, the way you write papers, you answer 5 questions of how, what, when, and why, but you're specifically outlining you put certain steps above others. Same thing if you're an architect major, if you're a sports major, each of those fields, they have a different way of writing a paper, which means there's a different genre of writing the paper. And in another video, I'll go in more detail about what genre means specifically related to academics. But for now, one of the ways you want to think about it is genre is a combination of form and situation. If I want to write a paper, let's say on the issues of fracking and how that is bad for the environment, the form I might want to pursue is a political based paper talking about the politics of the situation. And then the situation I'm writing in would be if I'm writing for a journal, or if I'm writing for a class paper, if I'm writing to maybe get this published in a newspaper, the situation of where I'm going to publish in combination with the form of what I want to write will influence the genre of the paper. So moving on to affect and rhetoric. When we talk about these two in combination with one another, the tools that writers use, their rhetoric, they will affect the audience. They're going to impact us. And largely, one of the better ways of thinking about this is that our first reaction to a lot of pieces of papers tend to be emotionally based. We disagree with them. We do agree with them. If we're watching a video, we laugh, we cry. There's usually an emotional reaction going along with this. Now, that may not be true for everybody, but I found in most of my students' papers that they're always first discuss the emotional reaction they had with a text, with a video, with a song, with a movie, with whatever. We tend to talk about emotional reactions first. So it's helpful to think about rhetoric in this way. How does it affect us emotionally? So keep that in mind. And what does this mean for you? Is that when we're writing, we're generally talking about our reactions. It's important to note that writing does not occur in a vacuum. We just don't suddenly have an idea and write about it. Oftentimes, we're going to see something or read something and write or speak or discuss in reaction to that. How often has it that you're discussing something with a friend and you say, hey, did you see this last night? Hey, did you read this? And then you'll start talking about what it is you read or saw. So you're doing something in reaction. And this reaction type of response lets us make critical and conscious remarks about how we see things work. So for example, I tend to watch a lot of TV, and one of the things I've always noticed on TV is the lack of minority characters. And there was a recent show, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, where the minority characters in the show outnumber the number of white Caucasian characters. And for me, that was very important to note because it was a primetime television show. The cast was incredibly diverse, and the show won numerous awards, and it was applauded all over for its diverse cast. And what was most interesting is that even though the show had good writing and good acting, a lot of people were praising it for its diversity, which automatically means that it's special, that it's unique in the fact that it had a diverse cast. And that's a good thing, but at the same time, it makes me wonder, why is it that we have to make that a unique case? Why is it abnormal when there's a show that has more minority characters than Caucasian characters? And then something like that, a question like that, would lead to maybe ideas about writing a paper on the state of television today and actors. Right? So I saw something, had a reaction to it, and then would write questions about it, and would write essays about it. So in English 1001, what I like to stress is using your own personal experiences, your own personal ideas about the world to put your personal voice into a discussion. So if you're passionate, let's say, about the sports of your home state, and there's just something incredibly wrong with the way those sports don't involve themselves in the community with activist work, then you could discuss the role of needing to be a community activist from the role of a sports fan. And maybe if you're passionate about sports and you're a really ardent sports fan, but sports fans don't get a lot of good public perception, then maybe your paper could be explaining why a sports fan would need to be a community activist to show that, hey, not all sports fans are bumbling drunks, as the perception goes. So to get to the angle of vision, Allen and Bacon, they apply this to writing, but taking it outside of the class, let's look at the angle of vision as it modifies our personal beliefs. So when we're in social situations, we use different personas when with our friends versus our families. We adopt different outlooks, and we present ourselves in different ways. And the reason why we're doing this is because we know that there are some things we can talk about with friends, then there are some things we cannot talk about with our parents. So we call this the angle of vision because our audience, how the vision we have of our audience will impact what it is we're going to say, what it is we're going to write, and what it is we're going to do. And so when we talk about this split decision, when you're starting to write something, you have to make the decision about who your audience is, what you want to say, to whom you're going to say it. And it's very important to know to whom you're going to say it. Because if I'm going to be writing for, let's say, an audience of my general peers, so fellow English teachers, I'm going to be using certain words, certain language, a certain style of writing that is very convoluted, a lot of thes and a lot of to be's and to was. It's just not good writing. Versus if I'm going to be writing in a general paper, publishing something for a public column, I'm going to adopt a different manner of speaking, probably adopt a more familiar tone so that I can convey the information in a much more accessible way. So when you're writing something or when you're shooting a video, anytime you're doing something, a split decision occurs in that you have to choose who your audience is going to be, because if you don't have an audience in mind, you're going to flounder in your paper because you don't have a base on which way you want to present your information. So just to do a recap of the angle of vision is that angle of vision is through audience, purpose, and genre. We start writing with an audience in mind, and with that audience in mind, we're going to write for a certain purpose about what we want to do, and a certain genre means we're going to write about it in a certain way. So if I'm going to be doing these educational videos, my audience is you. My purpose is to educate you on the text and action papers, and I've chosen video because you can't see me, and it's much more helpful to hear me rather than just reading my words on a page. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the 3 different styles of how we do rhetoric. I might have covered this in a previous video based on what order you've seen them in, but just a recap for those who've seen them. So logos is a high organization and structure. It appeals to a reader's sense of reason. You might find statistical information, and it's important to note that this is more evidence-based, as well as it relies on like a really, really well thought out structure for your paper. And the images I have here, I have Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes, a scene from iRobot, and a scene from Space Odyssey, to represent the logos and how it is that we perceive this logos appeal, being very mechanical, calculating, and cold. That doesn't mean it is that. Logos is just about well thought out structure. At the end of the day, it's about well thought out structure. So pathos is appealing to people's values and their beliefs through emotions. You see this a lot in rhetoric delivered through like sermons and pastors, also a lot of presidential speeches as well. And I'm trying to think of a good example. When President Bush was declaring for the war in Iraq in 2001, during his presidential speech, at the top of the video, there was banners proclaiming Operation Iraqi Freedom. So in those 3 words, Operation Iraqi Freedom, it was no longer about a war on terror. It was about a war of freedom, trying to free people. So those 3 words make this deep emotional appeal to the audience because we're fighting for freedom now. And that was pathos at work because it changed the perception of how the war was happening at the time. We often call this the easier of the 3 because we're pretty much familiar with its use. Every time we're telling a story to friends or to family, we're usually also talking about our emotions at the time. Like I was so upset when this was happening. We go into what made us upset to make a connection with the people who are listening to us so that they can understand what we're talking about. So moving on to ethos, this is not to be confused with ethics. Ethos is related to the author's credibility and the authority they have to speak on a subject. So in the 3 pictures I have here, I have Albert Einstein, Gregory House from House, and then this is Malcolm Gladwell, who writes a lot of books about society. I think one of those famous ones is The Tipping Point. So if I take Albert Einstein, who's a notable physician and mathematician, if he just were to write a paper, let's say on like the function of sports teams as related to economics, it'd be really hard for me to swallow a paper like that coming from him because I don't know any of his background, if he had any background in sports, if he was any knowledgeable about sports. But if he writes a paper about physics, well then yeah, I'm going to take it for his word. So when this applies to you as a student, a way to make yourself credible is to, first of all, cite your sources. So when you're discussing something, saying, this was written, we've seen this information before in this article, in this newspaper, written by this person, but here's my information that I'm adding to it. So with that sentence, you're saying, this is a subject people have written on, knowledgeable people have written on, I'm adding my 2 cents to add more ideas to the table. Something like that adds credibility to you because it shows the reader, the audience, that you've done research. And in that move, that they know now that you've done research, they're more willing to listen to what you have to say. So right here, this is an example from a movie called The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin, one of his very few movies where he speaks. And what I want you to do is I want you to pause this video here, click on this YouTube link, watch the video, and then just talk about just think about what it is, what rhetoric is used in this speech. He uses all 3, pathos, ethos, and logos, but I would want you to jot down either in a Word file or a separate piece of paper, and this is just for you, how it is that he's using the rhetoric. So when is it that he's using logos, this logical, structured approach, and how is he using it? When is he using pathos? And pathos just isn't the words. You can also, the rhetoric isn't just the words. You could look at body language, the way they're talking. Is their voice getting louder? Is it getting quieter? Are they emphasizing certain words? So just to recap, this is the triangle of rhetoric: pathos, ethos, and logos. So again, when we're going to move on to the text and action, when we're watching an ad, watching television, reading an article, there are 2 things to keep in mind. Is first of all the angle of vision, which is the purpose, audience, and genre. So what audience did the author have in mind? What purpose did they have in mind? And how did they write, or how did they present their information? That's your angle of vision. The second thing to accompany this is the triangle of rhetoric. How did they persuade the audience? Did they persuade them through an emotional appeal and pathos? Did they persuade them by just dumping them with I'm so knowledgeable about the subject, I'm an incredible authority, their ethos? Or did they present a well thought out structured argument and say, look, this is very logical. Don't you understand what I'm talking about? It's very plain to see. So as we move on with the text and action, keep those 2 triangles, I guess, in mind as you're watching ads. And when we're going to be doing the assignment, we're going to look at an ad or a television show, something you choose, and you're going to dissect those two triangles. How it is that the author presents their pathos, ethos, and logos. How do they persuade people? And also establish who their audience is, what their purpose is, what their genre is.